an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, hello, welcome in. Here we go. Looking at the middle of March already. And it's good of you to be here. It's Now and Next, Story Studio Network's flagship podcast. I'm Dave Trafford. And you know who you are. Away we go. Lots to talk about this week. A couple of things. We are launching new shows, as I said, all the time. And for those of you who are interested in the podcast space, we've been doing a series of webinars and, the how-tos and the basics. And how do you make sure you can get it off the ground and get it out the door and keep it consistent? Measure your metrics, all that stuff. So keep an eye on our LinkedIn page. Story Studio Network. If you haven't already subscribed, do that. If you're at all interested in the new media platforms, there's all kinds of good stuff there. And we'll tell you how to access some of the archives of that material. Yeah, it's really helpful because I know a lot of you, I've had a lot of calls lately just about people who are getting into it again, right? How do I do this? How do I do that? What's the best platform? How do I measure my metrics? All that stuff. So, Story Studio Network on the LinkedIn page. Otherwise, you can find me on all the social medias, by the way, at Dave Trafford. Threads, X, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. See Don Lemon got his show canceled before it even started on X because he pissed off Elon Musk, we think. I don't know why that's a story. All over the CNN. I mean, good God, they fired Lemon because he was an idiot on the air. I saw some of what was going on Twitter and his interview, quote unquote, with Elon Musk. And he's all pouty and hissy because he kicked him off the platform. Well, it's Elon's party. He can do what he wants. You can't hold a guy accountable for free speech if he doesn't want to listen to you. Period. Right? I mean, all this pouty nonsense. And we're just as bad here in Canada. We throw around freedom of speech, and the Americans throw around the First Amendment, freedom of speech, as if you can say anything anywhere. Well, that's true. You can. You can say anything anywhere, but there are consequences. And the real implications of freedom of the press and freedom of speech is whether or not the government can step in and shut you up and shut you down. That's where freedom of speech actually the rubber hits the road. It's not whether or not Elon Musk will allow you on his platform or whether or not, they'll allow Trump on the platform. That's got nothing to do with freedom of speech. Anyway, I just thought it was hilarious where CNN fired Don Lemon about a year ago because of stuff he said on the air. And now they have him back on as a guest with exclusive details on his interview with Elon Musk, bitching about what Don Lemon said on Twitter. And that Elon didn't like it. Well, who cares? That is the state of the media. We'll get into that a little bit here coming up. But I just want to tell you this week, we're talking about, it's a really interesting conversation we had at the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada conference. We were there last week. It's the largest mining conference in the world, and it happens in downtown Toronto, of all places. And I got a chance to connect with a group called Creative Fire. And they are a consultancy, they're a consultant group, and it's essentially an Indigenous-owned and operated and focused consulting agency. And what they do is they facilitate the discussions, conversations around development writ large. But in this case, they were talking about mining. But it can go beyond that. You know, it could be forestry, could be whatever it happens to be, particularly when it happens on the traditional territories of First Nations here in Canada. And they approach all of this through the lens of truth and reconciliation. And it's a really interesting conversation. So we're going to talk to Brandon Ringham coming up in the show. Also, talked about launching new shows. Parachute is back with their second season. Parachute's an injury prevention organization, and I crossed paths with them, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago when I was still doing the radio show. And they are essentially, like I said, an injury prevention organization, and in many respects, they're focusing on sort of the ordinary things that happen in your house. Falls, the number of injuries and days lost in work, and years lost of work because of falls, right? And in their first series, they talked a lot about just the basic dangers in your house that are affecting kids. Now, here's the interesting part about their story. The podcast is called Popping the Bubble Wrap. They don't want to wrap your kids in bubble wrap. They want to encourage and allow for riskier play, okay? Because there are consequences out there. And you got to learn that. Now, it's not dangerous play or hazardous play. It's riskier play. We learn from taking risks. So it's a really interesting version of that. So we'll get into that. And this being the St. Patrick's Day week, heading to St. Patrick's Day on this weekend, I'm going to fumble my way through a song I discovered this week. Yeah, I'm going to play the music for you. I'll actually play it for you. And it's all about the resilient and courageous spirit of immigrants and refugees who leave their homes hoping for a better future. And I had this real aha light bulb moment this week around it. And it just struck a chord with me. So we'll share that with you. Just be patient with me. I'm going to play the guitar and I'll offer you the song. And you can fast forward through it if you want. But I think it tells a pretty interesting story. Probably tells to some degree your story. There's an immigration story in your background. Unless, of course, you're an Indigenous First Nations Canadian. All right? And even that phrase gets thrown around. I mean, we could hazard to say that there are those in the black community in North America, they don't have an immigration story. They're here because of slavery. Not quite immigration, right? So, for the most part, anybody here who is not in those categories, those demographics, chances is pretty good you've got an immigration story. And I just thought this was one of those things that kind of lit a fire in my brain this week, quite by accident, because I took my mom and some of the crew to see a concert at the Rose Theatre in Brampton. I know, talk about following the bouncing ball. All right, that's all coming up right here on Now and Next. But first, I just can't get over this. The Kate and William photo shoot scandal. I mean, actually, it's Kate and the kids' photo shoot scandal, I guess. It's getting more media attention than the crisis in Gaza. Okay, that might be a bit of an overstatement, but not much. I even read today where media twisting itself into a pretzel, also they can broaden the angle just so they can include Harry and Meghan in this scandalous narrative. I swear to God. The investigative resources at major news outlets around the world are trying to twist this into something that has something to do with Harry and Meghan. Now, on the surface of it, I understand why AP and others might flag photos that are edited by the source. They should do that all the time. To pull it, one thing or another. To ask questions, okay. But surely they're a little late to the game, right? Newsrooms routinely take video and audio feeds of news conferences that are provided by the government of the day. That happens all the time. Now, there was a time when we wouldn't do that. When I was the news director at Global in Toronto, we refused to take the video feeds when they were provided specifically by the McGuinty government at Queen's Park. Why? Well, because the government got to decide what the camera saw. They decided what the microphones picked up, what they heard. It's subtle, but that content is being edited at the source. Okay? So you don't use it. Okay, fast forward. Now here we are in this post-COVID era, and newsrooms happily take the feeds that they're offered. It's easier and it's cheaper. Okay, so what does development on traditional Indigenous and First Nations lands and territories have to do with truth and reconciliation? How do you actually approach that? How do you deal with that? I managed to sit down. I talked to Brandon Ringham of Creative Fire.
Visiting today on Treaty 13 territory here in Toronto, traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Sorry, my coffee's still kicking in. I identify as mixed Indigenous on my mom's side. I identify as Native and French Canadian on my dad's side, more from Anglo ancestry, and it's important to talk about when we talk about the work that we do at Creative Fire in the spirit of reconciliation and building Indigenous economies, that we acknowledge the truth. And my truth is that I hold a lot of interesting facts of Canada's history in me. So I always start with what makes me, Brandon, going forward.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. So
there is, yeah.
I think it's interesting, Brandon, that we talk about your consultancy in terms of truth and reconciliation. I don't think that in and of itself is unusual, but I think it's important that it's in this room, right? When we talk about the strength and the predominance of mining specifically is where we are, but it's a natural resource, right? And so much of it happens, along with forestry, etc., on Indigenous traditional lands, you know? And as we have this conversation, it's really difficult, and you will know this better than I, to get anywhere with any kind of traction or substance without taking into account the traditional practices, whether it is in, you know, how we deal with our forests, our lakes, the mines, etc. So where does your consultancy live more, in terms of with First Nations and Indigenous communities, or with the non-Indigenous community?
It's exactly right in the middle. So although we are headquartered out of the Urban Common Reserve of English River First Nation in Saskatoon, we work nationally across Canada with both corporate clients that would be non-Indigenous owned or controlled, as well as the nations and the communities, Indigenous communities, Métis and Inuit across Canada. When we talk about how we engage our clients, depending on what it is, and quite often it's in the realm of sustainability, ESGI, or reconciliation. Those are quite often...
Just to hold on for a second, because we've been throwing around the phrase ESG a lot in this conversation. I know what the I is, and I think it's important for you to really highlight that.
Absolutely. So ESGI being environmental, social, governance, and Indigenous inclusion when we talk about materiality. So when we look at some of our corporate clients, again, specifically being here at PDAC looking at a lot of mining and natural resource clients, we need to be mindful of the Indigenous, Aboriginal, and treaty rights as defined in the Constitution and Indian Act. There's different terminologies. I know Aboriginal is not one we use quite often anymore, but
well, you don't use Indian either, but let's not go down that road.
yeah, we don't. No. Well, some people still do, especially being out in Calgary. There's quite a few folks who identify as Indian. That all being said, when we talk about that materiality, we do take an Indigenous traditional knowledge lens as well. So that's when we look to engage nations. Everything.
So let me just ask, because I think this is important. When you talk about the traditional Indigenous lens, and that's important. And then on the other hand, you're talking about you're not just a stakeholder, you're a rights holder, I think is the phrase I hear.
Yep.
And under the Constitution and all the whatever treaties were or weren't signed or acknowledged. Those two things are two different lanes to some degree, right? And one informs the other. When you open the conversation, where do you start that?
In terms of, when you say the two lanes,
when I say there's two lanes
and stakeholders?
When I say that if you're a rights holder and you approach it from there, and that is viewed in terms of the construct of our Constitution and our political setup. On the other hand, though, you're also looking at the traditional approaches and the traditional relationship with, the earth, generally speaking. Where does your conversation start, generally, more often than not, with that traditional approach and the observance of it, or the observance of the rights holder?
So we'll often start with the rights holder and understanding what inherent rights and treaty rights that those nations or communities hold. And when we're invited to community, and that's very important that we highlight the word invited, everything that we do in terms of community and Indigenous engagement, we are invited to participate. We do hold a lot of connections through our employees and through our previous work that allow us access and the privilege to be able to speak to a lot of communities and Indigenous stakeholders and rights holders as well. But when we go forward into actually having those conversations, it's important to understand the inherent rights and the inherent absolute musts and the absolute must nots when we go forward. And then we build, depending on what nation it is. Of course, we have over 600 First Nations here in Canada, so it's important to understand their creation stories, their cultures, their ceremonies, and understand the ways of knowing and the ways of doing that nation specifically wants to see reflected in the work that we provide to either the nation or to the community or corporate clients across Canada.
Is there a different conversation substantively when we're talking about mining versus, forestry or whatever other kind of area of natural resource that you might get into?
Yeah, and I think when we talk about mining, ultimately it is on treaty land or traditional territory. So there is a conversation around who has ownership of that land, who has rights to those resources, and then in addition, in relation to the extraction of those resources, then how does that interrupt traditional ways of life for those nations that claim that territory? As well, throughout mining operations, there's often effluent or any sort of runoff, slurry, brine, what have you, that can impact local watersheds, can impact local environments, forests, ecosystems. So it's important when we talk again through that ESGI lens that we consider Indigenous ways of knowing and doing when we go about building their environmental and their sustainability strategies.
So is there something, and again, that lens of the traditional approach, and I understand, that's 7 generations back and 7 generations forward in terms of how we define where we are in our relationship with whatever part of the earth that we're living on. It sounds like it's an important part of the conversation. And what the realization I've come to lately is we're coming around to a point where, generally speaking, the new science, the new technology is all beginning to embrace the Indigenous approach. They may not say that, they may not call it that, but they're actually embracing really old wisdom.
Yes, yeah.
And I just wonder how prominent that realization is as you kind of go through this process, whether or not maybe it's just me, but I get the impression that there has to be I get it now moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's a really great book that talks about this. So it's Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. For listeners, please feel free to check it out. Not that I'm sponsoring or anything. I don't get paid by it, but she's an ethnobotanist who blends her Potawatomi background with her scientific teaching. She's a professor at a number of different colleges, and she talks about what we would consider maybe a Western or Eurocentric scientific approach of all these controlled variables, all these different experiments, very sterile environments, with understanding the integration in an indigenous mindset in an ecosystem ultimately. And another great teaching that I had with Kita Gladu is it's how we perceive ourselves in different communities. So in the Western approach, myself, Brandon, I live in Calgary now. I identify as a skier, so therefore I belong to the skiing community. I identify as queer. I therefore belong to the queer community. You almost fracture yourself into all these different facets and clean-cut lines to belong to one community or another. The Indigenous perspective flips that around. Everybody in their entire being is a part of community. And when you bring everybody together, their strengths and their weaknesses, their proclivities, their whatever they may be that makes that person, that's when you can build strong and sustainable ecosystems and ways of life and communities and economies.
Yeah, and it's as simple as that sounds, and you will know this better than anybody, it frightens people.
It does. It
right?
does.
Because, again, we're back to this. We just had a conversation about we can't do it the way we've always done it.
No.
And taking people out, and you have literally described taking people out of their comfort zones in many respects, whether, it's how you identify as this, that, or the other thing, whether or not it's your land, you're a stakeholder, you're a rights holder. I want to get back to the beginning of the conversation. This is all happening around truth and reconciliation. This is at the heart of that truth.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
And being able to acknowledge that in terms of how we extract whatever from the earth is part of this truth and reconciliation process.
I agree. And it's important to understand the phrasing truth and reconciliation. And you will hear quite often from a variety of different people that truth must come before reconciliation. I think that we've done some really great progress on how Canadians understand Indigenous cultures and histories, as well as our modern presence today. I think people forget that we still exist here today, and that's a function of some of our education and some of the systems built around it. But when we talk about the truth, when we lay the facts out on the table, when we're able to understand all the grievances, all the broken promises and treaties, agreements, what have you, that's when you can say, okay, all the dirty laundry is aired. What do we look like moving forward? And we're resilient. We've been here thousands upon thousands of years with sustainable economies, trade routes, languages, cultures, ceremonies. We know how to adapt to change over time, Indigenous folks, that is. And when we look at adapting into the future, there's no hesitation about the role that Canadians play in reconciliation, whether it's different corporations, whether it's public communities, whether it's part of the government. There needs to be a common solution understood by all that encapsulates all of these various aspects, but with that Indigenous lens.
Yeah, and I hear people sort of spit back at me, well, we've all got our own truth. Yeah, I guess, but that seems to be a dodge. It's a way out and an unwillingness to acknowledge that, to your point, we've kind of got to get it all on the table and understand that we're, figuratively ripping the Band-Aid here.
Yep.
And it's going to hurt.
Yep.
Right?
And there's a lot of trauma that still needs to be healed through communities, through individuals that were the fallout of unfortunate acts, policies, and other acts of colonization. There's a lot of healing in communities, and it's not something that, again, is a distant past. It's something that's ongoing now.
Well, I tell this story. My mom grew up in Chapleau, Ontario.
Okay.
And she called me about a year ago, and she was in touch with a friend, a school friend, right? Mom's in her 80s now. He was in a residential school in their community. They did stuff together socially. They, all the stuff, you go to the rink and play hockey, all that stuff they did together. She had no idea what was going on. For whatever reason, she had no idea. whether it was because, and I don't think Mom wasn't paying attention. She's just not that kind of person. But she was close to these kids and didn't understand what they had gone through until 2 years ago. We find the unmarked graves and so on. And he talked to her about that. And one of her friends talked to her about that. And you talk about the pain, and I understand the pain that the Indigenous communities are suffering through. All of a sudden, she was overwhelmed because she felt like she had not done enough to help her friend when they were kids. And I don't think that's, and I'm not saying that that's an excuse by any stretch of the imagination, but that's part of it. And that's part of, sort of the other side of the coin where we don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that my friend went through that and I wasn't good enough to fix it or help him.
Yeah.
And there's a certain discomfort that we're not ready for.
And it's a hard conversation to really approach, and many people will hold different perspectives, right? Again, I want to stress we've got over 600 nations, we've got urban folk, we've got Métis, Inuit as well. Everybody will hold a different opinion, but the hard truth is, unfortunately, we are the product of a variety of different systems and oppressions that have led us to form certain mindsets or avoidances to tough conversations or really acknowledging the truth of what went on, throughout the course of Canadian history or the history of Canada. And this is something that I point out often. I'm 27, going to be 28 this year, born in 1996. So if anybody is older than I am, they've existed in a time in Canada's history where Indigenous, as they would call Indian residential schools and day schools, operated. A lot of folks don't know the last one closed in 1996, Gordon Residential School in Saskatchewan. And that throws people for a loop. And this is something we often hear when we talk to a lot of corporate stakeholders, is that their kids are coming home and they're teaching them things about Indigenous peoples, cultures, etc., that they had no idea about growing up. And this is my own perspective, is there is a lot that can be done from the individual who does not identify as Indigenous to learn more about the lands that they're on, to learn more about where they come from, to learn more about the Indigenous peoples around the community that they live, play, and work in. Ultimately, I don't believe that there should be an overwhelming feeling of guilt unless you're explicitly complicit in the acts of oppression, and you know what you're doing. But unfortunately, it's an ignorance of bliss, and a lot of people aren't ready for that conversation. You're right. A lot of people are scared to know what our government's done, what even some of our family histories have done in relation to Indigenous folks throughout Canada. And it comes without, a lot of time it comes without warning. There's new things that come up in the media, and it can be very jarring for Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks alike. But the important thing is that we acknowledge it and that we have the appropriate healing to move forward, I don't want to say move beyond it, but to move forward, acknowledge the pain, acknowledge the history, and take it one step at a time. And I think that's why messaging and having Indigenous voices to the table when we develop solutions for clients. I don't mean to go back to Creative Fire. We're on almost a different conversation, but when we develop those solutions, we make sure that we include Indigenous voices to provide that first-hand experience, those perspectives, those ideas, those thoughts, strategies, what have you. We really need to make sure that we are providing an opportunity for Indigenous voices to be heard throughout Canada. Again, external to the work that we do at Creative Fire. How can you and your community provide a safe space for Indigenous perspectives and ways of knowing?
Yeah, well, the C-suite conversation, the C begins to stand for courage, I think, more than anything, right?
Yeah.
Brandon, thanks for enlightening us. At some point, I'd like to catch up to you and talk to you about the conversations I've had with the folks at Meadow Lake, because I think that they are an incredible model of how the Indigenous community can not only thrive but create, a strong, robust economy in the resource area. So, but we'll have to catch up with you and talk to you again about that.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Dave.
Thanks for being here. Okay, as I mentioned, I had a chance to attend a concert at the Rose Theatre in Brampton this past weekend. It's a great facility, by the way. It was the first time I'd been there. And run primarily on the backbone of a lot of volunteers who made it a great experience. And we saw the band called Cherish the Ladies. I knew nothing about them before we showed up. I just picked a date so that I could, give my mom a Christmas present she would enjoy, and it was an experience at the concert at the Rose Theatre. It's an Irish-American ensemble, all women. In this case, the woman who plays the piano was on maternity leave, so there was a guy sitting at the keyboard. But it's a show driven by women musicians. And I discovered this beautiful song and a story about the first person who arrived when Ellis Island opened New Year's Day, 1892. And as I listened to it and their interpretation of it, it reminded me of all the Irish in my life and my family. I mean, there's Dunns and Donovans and Fitzpatricks, and I mean, it's, they're all over the place, and they're here. And quite frankly, I and my family wouldn't be enjoying what we enjoy if they hadn't decided to come here. And it reminded me of, sort of that existential threat that they faced, and so many of them faced, that forced them to leave a place like Ireland. And many landed, of course, in the U.S. and here in Canada. And as I said, I know we're celebrating St. Patrick's Day this weekend, and it'll mostly focus on the parades and the leprechauns and the beer and wearing your favorite green sweater, all that stuff. But this song, it's called The Isle of Hope, Isle of Tears. It really struck a chord with me and made me more appreciate, I guess, or just remind me, made me more aware. My 21st century privilege is really born out of those who mustered the courage to escape 19th century deprivation and to leave their homes and leave their families behind. Now, I don't think it would be a good idea, I don't think it would be fair, actually, to post someone else's recording of that song here without their permission. So if you will bear with me, I'll offer you my version of Isle of Hope, Isle of Tears. On the first day of January, 1892, they opened Ellis Island, let the people through. The first to cross the threshold of that Isle of Hope and Tears was Annie Moore of Ireland, was all of 15 years. Isle of Hope, Isle of Tears, Isle of Freedom, Isle of Fears. It's not the Isle of Home you left behind, that Isle of hunger and of pain, Isle you'll never see again. But that Isle of Home is always on your mind. The little bag she carried all her past and history, dreams for the future, this land of liberty. Courage is your passport when your old world disappears. No future in the past when you're all of 15 years. Isle of Hope, Isle of Tears, Isle of Freedom, Isle of Fears. It's not the Isle of Home you left behind. Isle of hunger, Isle of pain, Isle you'll never see again. But that Isle of Home is always on your mind. And they closed down Ellis Island in 1943. 7 million people come here for sanctuary. The springtime when I came here, stepped onto its piers, I thought how it must have been when you're all of 15 years. Isle of hope, Isle of tears, Isle of freedom, Isle of fears. It's not the Isle of home you left behind. That Isle of hunger, Isle of pain, Isle you'll never see again. But that Isle of home is always on your mind. Isle of hunger, Isle of pain, Isle you'll never see again. That Isle of home is always on your mind. Now, if you're still with me, thanks for hanging in there. The song was written by Brendan Graham, and it happened during a trip he took to the United States in the late 90s. And he was in Nashville doing some work there, and then made a stop at Ellis Island before he went back to Ireland. He went to Ellis Island, and he saw the pier. He saw the statue of Annie Moore. And on the way home in the plane, he started scratching down the lyrics, and it turned into that song.
I always say Annie wrote the song, I just kept out of the way, and that's why I keep her always on the piano as a source of inspiration.
The Cherished Ladies are among those who perform that song. There are plenty of others if you get a chance. You should check out the Cherished Ladies. Their recordings are fun and they're phenomenal, and if you get to see them in person, they're funner and phenomenaler. All right, how risky should the play be for our kids? There are, well, it's the pediatricians here in Canada coming around to it, filing a report recently that said if you want your kids to grow up and be healthy and well and resilient, you gotta let them have some risky play. Pam Fuselli is the president and CEO at Parachute. She's on board. Let the kids have some risky play.
It's essential to their healthy development and well-being. Like, they need to push the boundaries according to their level of development. So, when you're talking about a 1 and 2 year old, it's a different discussion than if it's a 7 or 8 year old. And I think that's where it gets a bit complicated, because there isn't one solution that I can tell you, at this age they can do this, and at that age they can't do that. So it's really about, the age of the child, the development of the child, knowing what they're capable of. Some kids have a longer attention span than others. Some are more coordinated than others. So, it's really parents know their kids best. And I think we also underestimate the child's ability to assess their own risk. So there's a number of different things that go into the recipe, if you will, of deciding whether this is a hazard or a risk. But, really the benefits of play far outweigh the probability of serious risk. I mean, their physical health, their mental health, psychosocial, like their interactions, their relationships, their problem solving, all of these things come through trial and error, through play, negotiation with their peers, all of that. And they lose that if we are not allowing them to push the boundaries.
How far behind are we in terms of that development for our kids based on your experience? Because I know you've been out in front of this for a long time, and and I know you're making progress in terms of some of the programs that have come up to talk about hazards versus the risk elements. But all of a sudden, it gets all of this media attention because the pediatricians across the country saying, there might be something to this."
Yeah, and in fact, we've been working with them for quite some time. As you can imagine, the position statement takes a while to develop. But they've been involved with other activities like the Outdoor Play Canada position statement on risky play. And so, we are definitely making progress. The conversation at the beginning was just, absolute horror about allowing or even talking about risky play. And it's funny when you start to talk about what risky play actually is, a lot of us will recognize it as play that we just did as kids. So it's, as you say, climbing a tree, being out of sight and away from your parents, unstructured, time, not, organized play, those types of things. And again, it's, the idea is to allow children to grow and develop skills. And when they are not able to do that, or when they're restricted too much, that doesn't happen. And then on the other side, if they aren't having that kind of physical activity, when you think about all of the detriments on the health side from, the obesity issue, and if they're inside, are they online, and what are they being exposed to there? So when you balance, everything's a balance. When you balance out, what is the real probability of injury? Outdoor play is not that risky.
No, clearly, and I think the other side of this is, and this really does overlap on a number of areas. I mean, we've talked about parents and the parents' role, and that, of course, that's the primary point of contact with these kids. But they spend a lot of time at school. Mm-hmm. And, I begin to wonder, what are the small things? And I'm sure you've got a thought or not on this, but as I just drive around our neighborhood at 3-ish in the afternoon, you can't get anywhere because you've got a long line of cars pulled up in front of schools that tell you not to pull into the driveway. And they're there to pick the kids up. And why do they pick them up? Because they aren't eligible for the bus. And the regulations around busing says you're within a certain period of a certain area of the school, which means you can walk to school and walk home safely. So we've got this. This is where both of them happen at the same time. The school allows this to happen. They say, you can take the bus if you live this far away. Don't pull it into the driveway because it's getting too dangerous in the driveway. But on the street, it's insane. We allow that to happen just tacitly almost. At what point can our educators sort of take this by the horns and say, here are the things that we can and should be doing? Even the sports you can play in the schoolyard. These days, if a kid brought a hockey stick to school, there'd be a Royal Commission inquiry to figure out, what do we do about this guy? It's part of that play. And liability, there's insurance, all those things are involved. This gets complicated in a hurry. It's not as simple as saying, let the kids get outside and play.
You're absolutely right. So there's a position statement that was published about 10 years ago from Outdoor Play Canada that I was involved with as well. And I mean, the discussions around the table had a multitude of sectors and perspectives, teaching, urban planning, insurance, injury prevention, psychologists, the whole, play experts, nature experts, all of that. They all have to come together, and the schools are part of that discussion. Going back to your first comment, I definitely have a lot to say about driving kids to school because it flies in the face of what we know. Getting in a car and driving is the most dangerous thing you can do. It's the leading cause of death and injury, serious injury. So, parents are driving their kids to school for a variety of reasons, one of which they want them to be safe. They don't want them to walk because they think that's more unsafe than driving, and time crunch. And I get the morning and afternoon. I know the juggling between work and all the other activities and things like that. But it's safer for your kids to walk to school than get into a car and drive. And as you say, more cars in and around the school area just increases that risk exponentially. And so working with the municipalities, with the schools, with the parent teacher associations, with the community, to try to find solutions that will increase the walking, wheeling, biking, whatever it is, not in a car to school. That's what we need to facilitate. And so each area, we have a elementary road safety school program that we've just wrapped up, but the resources are still there, that really took a look at and brought all of those people together to assess what the actual issues were with their areas, and then implement things like crossing guards, crosswalks, different configurations of the drop and ride, or having areas farther away from the school that parents can drop their kids off and then walking school buses, like picking up kids on their way to school and having an adult with some of the younger ones. How do you facilitate, if the goal is to get kids out and active and walking to school, what can we do to support that safely?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, you talk about that kind of group walk.
Mm-hmm.
When I was, 10 years old, my brother was only 7. And so we made sure that we all walked together. We weren't letting the 7-year-old walk on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was somebody along the street, Mrs. Sullivan would see us walk by, and the Sullivan kids would come out and join the walk. So it was that kind of thing where, oddly enough, everybody was paying attention to what the kids were doing at that point. So therein lies that level of safety and security. I don't want to leave before we talk about the podcast, because you actually bring in some of this lived experience on the show, where you've got parents sitting around the table talking about these very challenges, and they're legitimate. They're authentic questions and concerns, and what do I do about? But you're getting ready to launch a new series. And can we talk about who you're doing it with?
Sure. So we're really excited for season 2 of Popping the Bubble Wrap, and we're working with Amazon. They are supporting the work to bring us season 2. And as you say, we have authentic conversations. We really wanted this to be down to earth. What you would hear around your kitchen table if you and a friend were talking. And then we also bring in some experts to help clarify, because there may be things that you're worried about that you don't need to be worried about. And God knows there's enough to be worried about, that you don't need to be doing that for things that we know aren't, the leading causes. So yeah, we're going to have some more conversations about consumer products. That is a really hot topic. Things like car seats will be part of that. We're even going to touch on some of the more, what you would think is more kind of mundane around product recalls and standards for products in Canada. And there's some ahas that people are going to want to listen to that on, because not everything in Canada is tested for safety before it goes on for sale on the market. And most people think that that is the case. So we'll be touching on topics like that.
Well, it's not that we think it's the case. We would expect it to be the case, wouldn't we?
Well, it's true. It's true. And certain things have standards, other things don't, that you would think that they do. Why you need to fill out that warranty card and how it connects with recalls. So, it sounds kind of boring, but it really isn't, because when you take a look around at your home and the number of things that you think, that doesn't apply to that, is going to be a bit of a surprise, I think. But, talking about all things from, toys to cribs to how to keep things, products to keep things high and locked and keep your medications and other poisonous items in your house away from kids. So it really will span a number of different topics. And I'm really looking forward to speaking to some of the parents that were on the podcast in season 1, but a lot of new parents and some great experts.
Well, and as you're talking, I'm thinking that there's a whole new demographic, and this is from lived experience for all of this, and those are the new grandparents.
Yes.
Who are, right? And we're learning that we're 7-year-old grandparents now. So we're kind of down the road, but even at that, the girls live in Nova Scotia, so they're not here all the time. The boys, who are the youngest of the crew, live locally, so they're in the house more. So the whole question around, what do we do about that crib? What do we do about that? The whole magic of car seats is something new that we had to get used to. And your point around medications and what drawers are, accessible and available to a 3-year-old in the washroom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when they're visiting, I think grandparents' perspective is really important too, because they've grown up with certain things, and it's changed. I think that's the message too, is even if you have a child that's older, things change, like the regulations change. And if you have a younger child, I have a friend who has a 11 going on 12-year-old, and she's expecting. So, that doesn't sound like a long time, but things change. So yeah, there are always new people to talk to and new perspectives to get too.
Yeah. So, I would encourage you, if you're, the parent who's listening to this, it's probably one of those things that you might want to pass along to your parents when the kids, are that active and involved in the grandparents' house, because there's the information there is not specific to a generation. We're talking about how and where our kids behave and live. So, Pam, thanks for joining us, and good luck with the new series. We're excited about being part of that as well.
Thanks, Dave. We're really excited and really happy to be working again with Story Studio Network.
All right, that'll do it. Here we go. Yeah. Thanks to Pam. Thanks to Brandon. Thanks to you if you kind of hung in there and put up with my version. I just thought it was an interesting way of using music to illustrate a story that's right in front of us all the time. We talk about the great experiment that is the United States. Born at the end of a gun and revolution. We were born out of diplomacy and negotiation. But all of us, both countries, relying heavily on the immigrant story. And I just thought that song told us a great story. 15 years old, the first person to be registered at Ellis Island, 1892, January 1st. All right, that'll do it for me. Thanks for being here, Dave Trafford. It's Now and Next. Got a comment? Leave the comment, by all means. If you like what you heard, terrific. If you didn't like what you heard, leave us 2 comments, because we really want to know why. All good. Now and Next is the flagship podcast for Story Studio Network.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is Story Studio Network's flagship podcast, produced by our chief executive producer, Dave Trafford.